this is Ethiopia's political architecture cracking under its core.
Addis said in his speech in Addis Ababa, where he said, we have broken them.
What created the political conditions for every Amhara regional leader since 2018, if we talk?
Displacement of Amharas from Addis Ababa, sub neighborhoods in Addis Ababa and surrounding areas.
Sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war. We have seen the representatives of the AU, the African Union, and the IGAD.
It's inappropriate to call it Tigray war because much of the fighting happened outside Tigray.
Out of the 9 million children that are not going to the school in Ethiopia today,
on a daily basis negotiating between surviving or dying, and they decided to fight and die.
Do you see it could also fuel internal divisions within the Fano?
Remember that Amharas were excluded from Pretoria agreement.
But what does it mean? You have 5 presidents in 5 years. Welcome to the Standard Signal. I am your host, Tsedale Lemma. Today, we confront a question at the heart of Ethiopia's continued unraveling. Just 5 years ago, the Amhara regional state and its political elite were framed as a staunch ally or even a stabilizing pillar of Ethiopia's new political order following Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's rise in 2018. The region stood central to the federal state's power and to the narrative. But today, it is the epicenter of rebellion, militarization, and mass suffering. What unfolded in between is not only a regional state crisis, it is the story of a national political architecture cracking from its center. Since 2018, we have witnessed a churn of leadership without precedent. The regional state itself has witnessed 5 regional presidents in 5 years, each of them removed, discredited, or killed. We have seen wartime allies mutate into open confrontation. We have watched a ruling party hollowed out by purges, and we have watched the Fano collective shift from celebrated wartime allies during what is popularly known as the Tigray War to the federal government's most serious internal security threat. But beneath the political collapse lies a deeper, darker layer, the immeasurable human cost borne overwhelmingly by civilians, women, children, and the elderly. A recent investigative report by the BBC revealed a disturbing detail of sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Communities are cut off from medical care. Health workers are facing retaliation simply for documenting abuses. In many cases, entire districts are flattened by fighting with no real end in sight. And there is no credible accountability mechanism in place. But even as genuine negotiations remain absent, last week we witnessed a symbolic peace agreement, seemingly crafted for public relations value. And it was signed by an individual with no active command authority within one of the Fano collectives. And it was validated by continental institutions that should know better. So today we ask, how did Ethiopia's political core become engulfed in war so quickly and with such a devastating cost for human lives? How do we understand both the broader political failure and the human catastrophe it continues to produce? Is there a way to prevent a protracted insurgency without an end? Or, however unlikely, a chance for a genuine political reset? What does real accountability look like in this context? To help us unpack these questions, I am joined by someone who brings both scholarly depth and frontline insights. Dr. Hone Mandefro is a PhD candidate in sociology and anthropology at Concordia University. where his research examines rapid urban expansion, housing transformation, and the broader challenges of inclusive, sustainable development in Ethiopia. His works appeared in leading journals, including the International Review of Sociology and the Journal of Modern African Studies. But Hone's contribution extends far beyond academia. Currently, he serves as advocacy director of the Amhara Association of America, leading a casualty recording team documenting human rights violations against Amharas across Ethiopia. It is one of the most critical and painstaking forms of evidence collecting work in any conflict setting. Previously, he has provided analysis on the topic for the New York Times, BBC, France 24, and Al Jazeera. And longtime readers of Addis Standard will remember his sharp and consistent commentary throughout the early and mid-2010s. Hone joins the Standard Signal today at a moment when Ethiopia faces both a structural political crisis and human rights emergency. A moment that demands the combination of analytical rigor and grounded advocacy he brings. Hone Mandefro, welcome to the Standard Signal.
Thank you. Thank you, Tsedale. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Hone, let's begin from the beginning. You heard from my introduction that we will be mainly discussing the crisis in Amhara region, but we will not be separating it from the broader political failures or the political architecture failures in the Ethiopia level. So I think it's for me, it's natural to ask you, to begin this interview by asking you, how did the crisis in the Amhara region get here? Before we put it in the broader context, it has been 2 years since the ongoing civil war involving the federal and regional forces on the one hand, and the different segments of the Fano structure. I think you can tell us more about that, but on the other. And that's excluding the 2 years of what's now commonly known as the Tigray War, about which much has been reported. So how does a region once seen as Ethiopia's political anchor of stability become the epicenter of war in a span of 5 years, Hone? If you could walk us back and enlighten us a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsedale. I think that's an important question to understand how things have unfolded, but also what could be done to reverse the trend that has been going on in the region and more broadly, as you said, in the country. But we may have to go far beyond 5 years to understand the conflict in Amhara region. And this is because this war in Amhara region, or at least its series didn't start 5 years ago. In fact, it predates the Abiy regime. It predates TPLF even to a certain degree, because the fundamental reason Amharas are fighting in the region, or at least Fanos are fighting the Abiy regime, is because they have come to a point where they have realized there's no table where Amharas are allowed to sit in Ethiopian political discourse. And this quest for, to be at the table, to be to present their grievances and to kind of seek a solution that is good for everyone has been going on during TPLF-led Oromo, TPLF-led EPRDF, and now Oromo Prosperity-led the Prosperity Party under Abiy. But I think what has happened in between is, obviously, there was a number of triggering factors that contributed to the immediate outburst of the war. One of them being, we've seen ever since, Abiy became prime minister, the massacre of civilians, particularly Amharas, have been happening everywhere. And actually, ever since Abiy came to power, Amharas have been protesting again and again across Ethiopia, but mainly in Amhara region, calling for an end to these atrocities, killings of civilians, particularly in Oromia region, but in other regions as well. And this repeated ask for ending of violence against Amharas have been met with more violence. You might recall, in April 2023, there was a widespread demonstration in Amhara region that involved, tens of thousands of Amharas and happened in more than 24 cities. And the response from the region was to kill more of those protesters. And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons that the violence against Amharas have intensified instead of being contained. And they not only it intensified in magnitude, the response has been honestly from the elites, particularly Oromo Prosperity Party leaders, it was justified. It's acceptable to kill them. And we have seen a number of recordings leaked, but also public speeches, such as what Shimelis Abdissa said in his speech in Addis Ababa, where he said, "We're blocking them. We're going to separate them. Those of you who are speaking and who are not an Amhara, you should be quiet. We are doing our work of suppressing or confusing Amharas, and this is beneficial for their dominance." But also, I think there was an increasing intensification of violence, particularly in urban areas. If you see the trend of atrocities, it used to be in remote areas where we see mass massacres. Now, over the past 5 years, that has reached even the capital city, Addis Ababa. We have seen, at least according to our organization's documentation, targeted violence, displacement of Amharas from Addis Ababa, neighborhoods in Addis Ababa and surrounding areas. And also we've seen, refusal of access to their capital city, to the Addis Ababa, when Amharas tried to come to the capital city from Amhara region. We've also witnessed other forms of, the violence, such as, mass arrest of politicians and all that. But I think the immediate reason that led into, or the immediate cause that led into the breakout of this fighting in Amhara region is the attempt by the Prosperity Party regime to disarm the Amharas. And Amharas naturally took that as a way of disarming them and denying them of any agency to respond and to protect themselves from this continued state-led violence that the Ethiopian state has been committing ever since the country was divided into ethnic homelands. And that led into a situation where people were given an option of, being disarmed, stay quiet, accept whatever you were going to do to you, or they have to try to respond in whatever capacity they wanted. And that led into, obviously, the refusal among Fano leaders, among members of Amhara Special Forces of the disarmament campaign that was targeted against the Amharas. And according to the government's admission, about 70% of the Amhara Special Force members refused disarmament and they joined the Fanos. That led into, the establishment of different Fano groups in the region that has now, coalesced into two main organizations within the Fanos, the Amhara AFF and FPO, led by Iskender, and then the FNF under the leadership of the Mere and Azeres. But it was an outburst. It was a kind of a natural reaction to essentially an offer from the government to be disarmed and essentially, be out of any means of defending themselves amidst the mass atrocities and mass violence that we have seen in many parts of Ethiopia. But of course, people would also remember that Amharas were excluded from the Pretoria Agreement. That is a reflection of the number of mistakes, not only I think analysts, but also policymakers that helped to the Pretoria deal made in that process. As you know, Amharas were one of the warring parties in northern Ethiopia war, and I think here I would say it's inappropriate to call it Tigray war because much of the fighting happened outside Tigray, and the largest group that was affected by this war in terms of population was the Amhara region. And it's just a matter of geography. If you see where the fighting happened, what's involved, it's appropriate to call it Tigray, the northern Ethiopia war, not Tigray war. But as one of the parties to that conflict, Amharas were not allowed to come. And that led into viewing the agreement as a war pact between the Oromo Prosperity Party and the TPLF. That also contributed to the sense of betrayal, sense of insecurity Amharas felt. And when that campaign to disarm Amharas came just a few months after the Pretoria deal, it was seen as the last, attempt before a joint war between TPLF and Prosperity Party was launched against Amharas. And that has proved to be by and large true, but that also contributed to the immediate outbreak of the war. But as I tried to argue, this is a war that has been in making for decades. And it just came to a point where now, because the situation on the ground has come to a point where Amharas are essentially on a daily basis negotiating between surviving or dying, and they decided to fight and die.
Thank you, Hone. You gave us that background. Provided that the depths and the scope of the background that you gave, one of the things that I see widely believed to be is that this crisis is an Amhara region crisis, right? So if you are talking to the diplomatic community, if you're even talking to the power holders by way of asking what would be the solution for that, is the easy answer you get is this is a crisis that is of the making of the Amhara region, right? And so what you outlined here, some of it might be shared, some of it might be disputed, but this is not a conversation about, disputing or confrontational interview, but it's about listening. It's about understanding from the vintage point of view that you see the conflict and what would lead to the possible solution going forward. So it is evidence that this is Ethiopia's political architecture cracking under its core. If you talk about 5 regional presidents in 5 years, what does that reveal about the political dispensation under the ruling Prosperity Party, right? What created the political conditions for every Amhara regional leader since 2018, if we talk, to be removed or replaced or discredited or assassinated? So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, to what extent is this political crisis organic versus engineered through federal interference or the dispensation by the Prosperity Party intentionally to weaken? I mean, I would love to hear from you. I would like you to analyze that in a broader sense of it. Is this as is widely now being seen now that we are almost in the 5th year of the war in the Amhara region? Is it safe for me to say, or you can maybe broaden on that one? Is it one of those intentionally political plays? Let me put it like that, by the ruling Prosperity Party to weaken the Amhara body politic. Do you see it like that? And how do you and its relations with the Ethiopian state in the broader? You mentioned about the Pretoria. I was about to come to the Pretoria Agreement and the fallout or the political earthquake, let me put it like that, after the signing of the Pretoria Agreement. I remember the Amhara Association of America was lobbying to be included in the negotiations during the negotiations that took place in Pretoria in November of 2022. So I guess I'm broadening my question here, Hone, because I want you to reflect on that, and I want to hear, and I want our audience to hear from you. when it comes to the Pretoria, I'd like to come back later. But what I said a bit earlier is the narrative that this conflict is, internally of Amhara region-making conflict. Can you elaborate on that one? How do you situate it into the broader collapse of the political order in the Ethiopian body politic under the leadership of the prime minister? I want you to focus on that one because I'm no historian. To going back would further broaden it. But what does it mean? You have 5 presidents in 5 years turned out, right? So even that, what does that tell us, Hone?
Well, that's a good question. I would just want to make one correction, and then I will come to this question. In terms of the Pretoria, I know we will come back to it, but I just want to say Amhara Association of America was not lobbying to be included in the negotiation, but you are right. We were lobbying for Amhara's inclusion in the Pretoria, but not as just the broader Amhara community. Including the diaspora. So you are right in pointing that out. But we'll park that for later. And coming to your question, whether this is of like an organic development from the region or is it from outside? Definitely. This war, as I said, is not a making of Amharas. It was imposed on them. And it was imposed by Abiy as far as we attribute the attempt to disarm the Amhara special forces while ignoring their questions and therefore leading to suspicion that or feeling that Abiy is moving to crack down and kind of suppress Amharas without any form of resistance in a form of military or otherwise. So the Amhara, this was a war that was made out of the region but imposed and moved to the region. And there were multiple phases, as I kind of tried to indicate in my previous answer to your question, Tsedale. But the first, and I think the structural cause, is the continued closure of space for Amharas for political dialogue and negotiation to address historical grievances they have. And this goes back to the 1990s process, the exclusion of them from the writing of the constitution, but also after that during TPLF-led EPRDF. In 2018, as you remember, there was, so to say, an alliance between Oromo elites and Amhara elites to push out TPLF out of power and bring about a much more inclusive transition that would address the questions of both Amharas, Oromos, and others. And that transition was felt. It was not mismanaged. I think to characterize it as mismanaged would suggest that there was an attempt, there was a will to manage it properly. As we discovered later from the speeches of Abiy himself, but also other Oromo prosperity party leaders, was that Oromara alliance between Amharas and Oromas was a theater. It was an attempt to confuse and kind of essentially lead Amharas into deception to believe that these long-standing grievances they have had will be addressed, provided that they lend their support to the election of Oromo Prosperity Party leaders to power, which the Amhara Prosperity Party leaders agreed and supported. And at that point, there was a little bit of like question from some Amhara leaders saying that to what extent we do believe these people, including Abiy, would be trustworthy to bring about the change we want to address Amhara response, the Amhara long-standing grievance. And the response from Amhara Prosperity Party was, we believe them entirely. That's why we're not going to seek power, but we're going to give them power, and therefore we will be supporting them. One of the people that said almost word by word this response was Gedwa Dargach, who soon after was pushed out and threatened to be arrested and had to leave abroad and seek refuge, as far as I know. But it's not just isolated to Abiy. The broader trend was this political support of Amharas to Abiy regime was treated as being full, and then right after Abiy took over power, the Oromo Prosperity Party went into consolidation. That required suppressing and weakening the Amhara body politics, as you said. One of the ways for Abiy wanted to do that was to make sure whoever is in Bahar Dar is not listening to the people, but to him. So you have these presidents who are appointed. And then there is, because it was in a period of transition, there was a strong pressure from the public to focus on addressing long-standing Amhara grievances. This would mean, ensuring the political representation of Amharas across the board, including in other regions, but also essentially there were a number of economic reasons. Obviously, the annexed lands of Walkayet and Raya were there. So there was this president would face a kind of very strong forces kind of pressuring them from two directions. On the one hand, you have the people who believed they mobilized and have achieved to push out TPLF out of power, and therefore their long-standing grievances should be addressed. But on the other hand, you have Abiy and his colleagues essentially pressuring this president to suppress this demand for transition in the region, but also broadly, and eliminate any political actor pushing for this. That led into each of these presidents trying to manage this pressure in their own way. Some of them preferred to stand up against Abiy. They were removed. Some of them were essentially opted to press the public to kind of give up on their hope of transition. And that led into their ouster, not just in the broader Amhara population, but within the Amhara Prosperity Party at that time, there was strong desire for change. So they were pushed by the party itself. That obviously led into, Abiy appointing one president after another to extent it was a joke that any president that was assigned to or taking over power in Amhara region would not last more than a couple of months, which was true. So that constant change was a desire to weaken Amhara's political actors and to make sure that they don't have any agency, to make sure that they will not withstand for the dictatorial ambition of Abiy as an individual, but also, I think, to the broader desire of Oromo political elites, particularly Oromo Prosperity Party, to dominate and build another hegemony after TPLF's hegemony was replaced. So in one of my pieces, as you might notice, as I referred that transition period as a transition from one hegemony to another, from TPLF to Oromo Prosperity Party. Obviously, this should not be confused as leading into benefit to any ordinary Oromo. That is far from the truth. And in a broader Ethiopian political history, elites have always been, about themselves, not necessarily the larger public. So, but it's this continuous removal of anyone who dares to stand up against this ambition to build Oromo Prosperity Party hegemony has led into a continuous removal of actors. And this is not just limited to Amhara region, Tsedale. If you have noticed, Amharas in the federal government were also constantly replaced. So to the extent only one or two of the first cabinet members in the first cabinet of Abiy have remained to have any relevant position. The others have been pushed out. Some of them were arrested, including members of parliament and Yohannis Bayalo, who was one of the hard fighter against, one of the people who fought against TPLF. Others were pushed out and kind of forced to seek asylum elsewhere. So at the center is this desire to not listen to Amharas, to deny them of any political agency, and to make sure that their long-standing grievance is never addressed, but actually is depicted as a problem to be managed. And that has led into the crisis we have seen. And there is little understanding of this. And I think that contributes to what you initially rightfully diagnosed, which is this is an issue within Amhara region. No, this is not an issue in Amhara region. To the extent Amharas are concerned, it's everyone outside Amhara region is impacted. We've seen mass arrests in Addis Ababa, in other regions. The state of emergency that was designed or declared after the Fanos took up arms against the Abiy region was indicative of that, because it didn't say this state of emergency will be implemented in Amhara region. Unlike let's say, in the case of Tigray, it said anywhere outside Amhara region, indicating it's an indication of, or an admission that it's not contained within Amhara region.
Yeah, thank you, Hone. There are, when we talk about the continued war right now happening in there are those reasons that led to it, which you have outlined, and then there are those immediate causes that created the outburst, that created the immediate clashes in April of 2023, which was preceded by the desire by the federal government of disarming the the regional special forces. So when we outline the causes in that, I think we can chronicle it in that order. Not only we can talk about the question of fertilizers by the Amhara farmers, by the way, or the disappearance of 17 women students from the university, which we know reporting, and the protests that followed after that, and the response from the power holders to these protests, to the farmers' protests of demanding fertilizer and seeds, right? So we can chronicle as the swelling impacts of the ongoing war right now, with its immediate reason being the decision by the federal government and the army to disarm and demobilize the Amhara special forces. So we can chronicle it like that. I want to come back to the Pretoria, because that was prior to that. What the disarmament effort by the federal government was in April of 2023. But in November of 2022, the Pretoria Agreement to end the war, that devastating war that in the Tigray, Afar, and Amhara regions, later on expanded to Afar and Amhara regions, was signed, and we can trace the immediate fallout from that moment onwards. I think the question here I wanted to ask you is that, was excluding, as the Amhara Association of America, you corrected me, thank you very much, earlier, not to participate, but for Amhara representatives to be a part of the peace negotiations. Many people agree that the peace negotiations or the ceasefire negotiations, there is no peace negotiations as we have seen it, should have included all belligerents that took part in that war. I think that has been proven down the line now. So as the Amhara Association of America, when you were lobbying, when you were working behind the scenes to have the representatives from the Amhara political community to be part of the Pretoria Peace Agreement, what did you gather after that? Like, was excluding the Amhara representation a miscalculation or a deliberate political choice? What did you make of that? Why we're trying to understand in hindsight now. What was the use of not involving the Amhara political community who have been engulfed in the wars? Was it a mistake? First of all, was it a mistake in hindsight? I think this is an easy yes to say. But for you, was it a miscalculation or a deliberate political choice that was playing out? Because the Pretoria Agreement signed was mediated by international actors. Hone, what was your reading of that?
I think a short answer is it was both miscalculation, but also it was a a deliberate choice. A deliberate choice in as far as two levels. I think from a technical point of standing, like from a technical point of view, when we talk to these officials, as you would know, like we've been directly speaking to architects of that deal, including from the United States government, and their approach was the lesser the parties, the easier to reach an agreement. And they were driven to deliver something after many years of trial that they were genuinely desperate to get something, even if that's not ideal. So I think a very positive reading of the reasoning from them would say adding more partners would complicate it. It would make it difficult to reach an agreement. And so that is like, for folks who are not privy to internal discussions or are not necessarily well versed with dynamics of the parties to the war, were thinking that. So we have heard that argument. But also there was a sense that, yes, Amharas as one party would have to be involved, but we would be better off to ignore them and contain them. And I think that was the official position from the lead negotiator, mediators, and guarantors of the deal. There was an understanding, and this was a result of the misinformation they were victim of. They assumed that the Amharas were fighting against TPLF for the same reason Abiy was fighting against TPLF. We have consistently provided analysis showing that Amharas are in this fight for two reasons. One, primarily because the fighting was brought to them. TPLF came to the Amhara region, and as multiple human rights reporters have demonstrated, have documented, there were mass atrocities, rape, and other forms of violence that TPLF fighters committed. So that led into a large segment of population to join the fight against TPLF. But prior to that, as I've alluded earlier, there was long-standing question Amharas had against TPLF, or grievance against TPLF, including the annexation of Walqait and Raya, which was, if not the main cause, the fuel that mobilized Amharas in the fight against EPRDF in the 2016 and 2017. So there was a sense that the local population, including Amharas in Walqait and Raya, felt they needed to liberate themselves, and therefore they joined the fight. Well, along with EPRD, along with the National Defense Force. But I think this is also one of the misinformation is many of those folks never crossed outside beyond that, at least in the first round of the fighting. They Walqait liberated themselves, they established their own administration, they started to administer themselves, but never crossed to the other part. So this shows that they were in the fight for completely different reason than Abiy. Abiy knew this. He was cognizant because he mobilized Amharas citing these things, as you would remember. And in fact, their agreement to quickly establish an Amhara administration in Walqait is a confirmation of like how this was sold to Amharas. You're not fighting TPLF for Abiy, you're fighting TPLF for your own reason. And this was widely the understanding within Amharas. So a lot of the lead guarantors and mediators of this peace agreement didn't know this. They were not aware of this dynamics. What they were told is this long false narrative that, Amharas support Abiy and they are fighting in support of Abiy because they like Abiy and they want Abiy to stay in power. This is while Amharas, before the war, during the war, and after the war, have been consistently protesting against his administration because the violence against Amharas have never stopped. during the war. In fact, the most intensified, the largest massacres against Amharas happened during the war. And therefore, in protest against this, continued state complicity and support for atrocities against Amharas in other parts of Ethiopia, Amharas were protesting. So in fact, I would say the largest pushback, if you count by the number of demonstrations, the number of media mobilization against Abiy regime came from Amharas. But this didn't reach the international community enough. There was misunderstanding of the relationship between Amharas.
The timeline was not also that consistent. I would say, the appearance, protesters against let me say, against the federal government, the opposition against the prime minister was not that. It was coming in and out, on and off.
Yes.
Something happens now, and then a protest erupts, and then it goes back again. So there was that inconsistent timeline in the protest against the federal government. Maybe that played a role in that, and some of the accounts may have to be, established with an independent fact-finding missions and all this. I think is one of the reasons why we need to have an independent investigation of things that are happening and have happened in Ethiopia, including the war in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar region, because we need to establish the facts. We need to get to the conclusion of how to solve the crisis. If we wanted to solve the crisis, we need to reach at the conclusion of the truth, right? That's what I believe. Personally. I wanted to bring you to talk about beyond the political collapse. Right now, what we were discussing about is a political collapse. I can categorically call it a political collapse. But beyond that, Hone, lies the silent catastrophe, which is lost in the details of the political collapse, the crisis, often covered, which the civilians are bearing the heaviest cost of this. So I want you to, over the past 2.5 years, we've even, with the smallest team that we have at Addis Standard, we've been chronicling the devastation on women, children, and the elderly are absorbing, the immeasurable cost, the destruction of the system. I mean, now, even after the report last week or two ago by the BBC, I can say now that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war, which is not unheard of in the current political dispensation that we have. And there is this mass displacement. There is this war that decimated the health system, that decimated the schools. Out of the 9 million children that are not going to the school in Ethiopia today, almost half of them are from the Amhara region, followed by in Oromia region. So I think what I want you to highlight this is lost in the details. It's, often advocacies are also focused on that political crisis, that political collapse. Walk us through, as somebody who is working in the advocacy section, what immediate steps must be at the national and international levels to hold this kind of wanton destruction and deaths of civilians accountable? What measures should be taken? What is your advocacy when it comes to that? Like having an independent investigations into this violence. Walk us through the work that you're doing, because that is, I think, the most painstaking work of documenting this kind of crimes. Share your experience with our audience, Hone.
Thank you, Darala. I think this is an important aspect. If I may just conclude my thought on the previous for a minute, I was talking about the miscalculation. And I think one aspect of the miscalculation was undermining the capacity of Amharas to resist, to fight back. And this was visible in a way when the fighting erupted. Then Secretary of State Blinken came out and essentially in public asked Abiy to go after whoever is creating this fighting in Amhara region, and there was the assumption, the reading, including from former special voice of the U.S. government, was if ever Amharas were to resist, they would be kind of contained in a matter of weeks. And that's what also the Abiy regime folks were telling them as they were telling the Ethiopian public, which led into, I think, this miscalculation was not just among the foreigners. I think even among Ethiopian domestic political actors, there was the sense that the not appreciation, the wider grievance Amharas have, and the long-standing quest for this kind of pushback. And I think that led into the undermining the prospect for fighting. If there was appreciation of the capacity to respond, perhaps there would have been more calls for inclusion of Amharas in the Pretoria deal, but also to do something to prevent the war, which has become very, very devastating, as you said. And my organization, Amhara Association of America, has spent whatever meager resource we have to try to document this. And we started documenting this, as you pointed out in my introduction. I'm primarily an academician. I identify myself as an academician. I've been teaching in Ethiopia, particularly in Gondar, which is one of the worst hit areas in the ongoing fight. But in 2018, 2019, when this violence against Amharas continues to happen again and again, there was this sense that, not many international actors were paying attention, but also even if they were to pay attention, I think the magnitude was way larger than they could respond to. And I think, so that led into us hiring for the first time what we call human rights investigators. And since then, we've been documenting our work, not just recently, but for the last 5 years. And this has really shaped my view of Ethiopian politics in a profound way. I think it made me, to a certain degree, very much angry. I think people might see that some form of emotion in this interview as well. And the anger comes from two things. I think, one, the level of atrocities that's happening in Ethiopia, not just about Amharas, but more broadly in Ethiopia, has become very normalized, and it's not generating news. It's no longer newsworthy. And international media outlets that would be quick to report on, atrocities elsewhere, in Ethiopia, it's taken as normal, and therefore it's not getting enough attention. And we've seen, that very consistently. And when that is met with like victimhood or like meet with personal experience of violence, as you could imagine, my own family members were killed in Oromia. My own family is displaced in the past 5 years 3 times from Gondar, particularly Guy, that has seen one of the heaviest fighting in the northern Ethiopia war. And then since then, multiple rounds of fighting between the Fanos and the federal government or the Abiy regime. And that has led to continuous displacement of people. But I think the most devastating has been what's happening to the youngest population. As you pointed out, now there's no schooling in Amhara region. Based on the data we compiled from lower officials, it's not just ours, even by the government's data. About 1,200 schools were closed or damaged in 2023. This was almost 2 years ago. And out of the 7 million school-aged children, about 5 million of them were out of school. And this was again 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2024, that was the number from 2024. And I don't think it's any better for this year either. There's no clear data that came out for this academic year. But 2024, that was the number, yeah.
And that's the number admitted by the Amhara Region Education Bureau itself. And so it's a region's data we're talking about. But also, a number of these schools are used as military hubs, and a number of these are essentially in this campus for a number of families that are living adjacent to this often leads to what you alluded, the sexual violence. These schools have become the launching pad for further attacks, such as soldiers walking around neighborhoods, raping women in mass, leading into, as you pointed out, based on BBC's investigation, 2,679 women were raped. And this is just from 4% of the total health centers. They were able to gather data. Yeah. And imagine, obviously, as you know, the chances of women being raped and going to health post to report or to seek is almost very minimal. It's very, it doesn't happen that often. But even if we were talking about those women who went into this 4% of the total health posts in Amhara region, BBC was able to document and verify 2,679 women who were raped, and many of them have become, HIV positive, have given birth. And this is a tragedy. It will hunt the population, the larger Amhara, but also Ethiopians for decades. The psychological trauma people are experiencing. And I think in the previous fightings, the fightings would be kind of isolated into one area. The nature of the war in Amhara region is it's happening everywhere, and it's happening intermittent. There's no predictability into it. That leads us into a situation where people cannot predict and avoid these atrocities, avoid the fighters. So people are dealing with a situation where every day they're gambling between staying in home, probably at least avoiding bullets, stray bullets or bullets targeting them. If not, they wouldn't avoid those who are visiting to rape and kill them. But at least if they stay home, they would avoid a stray bullet as well. But then that would mean they would have to die out of hunger. So every day they're gambling the debate between should I stay in home and kind of try to stay alive while being starved, or should I go do something to get food and risk being raped and killed? Yeah. So this is a story that's happening everywhere in the Amhara region, as has been reported, by several media outlets. About 8% of the region is under the final control, and the military launches fightings or campaigns to kind of regain these areas from cities, and therefore there is a fighting on a daily basis and across the region. And that has really worsened the human rights situation. On top of that
is one of the things we often don't talk about, that the breakdown of protection mechanisms for civilians, right? When you describe the nature of the war itself, what it reveals is, and we've seen this, by the way, in many places in Oromia region as well. So what it reveals is that there is a complete breakdown of any mechanism to protect civilians. That is one of, and the things that we don't talk about it on top of that. So there's no command, oversight, or civilian protection. And most cases are unrecorded, unreported. And culturally, women not being able to even come forward, even if they want to, in some cases, there is that element of the culture as well, that the stigma, the idea of living with that story among the same society, where a woman has to come forward to tell the stories. And that was one of the things, the most devastating nature of the war in the Tigray region as well, that it has turned women's body into a weapon of war, right? And so there is a particular nature of all the conflicts that are happening across Ethiopia in many places. Very distinct nature. Probably, it's better to come back to it in a very dedicated podcast. But what you said earlier as well, by way of agreeing with you, Hone, is that one of the things that led to that to this level now is that there is always that miscalculation. In fact, after the prime minister came to power, the first conflict happened in Oromia regional state, right, where the Oromo Liberation Army's presence was limited to the western part, western Oromia, around in and around the four Wallagas there, and there was always that miscalculation. Instead of having a broader analysis, scenario building, culture of what does it mean to the politics? What does it mean if it's not solved? There's always that miscalculation, and that is exactly what was, I guess, in the Fano collective. There were, in the beginning, there were around 200 different structures. We can talk about now 2 organized Fano collectives, if I can say that now, from the 200 different sporadic groups down to 2 right now. And then with the war itself, the federal government still talking about a few traitors, a few shiftas, a few bandas. The army general a few months ago said like 90% of the war is over. Now what is left is 10% of it, and we will be done with that. So there's always that miscalculation. Whether that is a deliberate thing, it requires its own analysis. But this brings me down to the discussion now. We talked about the Fanos, being from that very sporadic and very unorganized, or 200 different groups, and now we're talking about 2 very strong. You may shed light on that one. 2 very strong structures within the regional state, and I guess I'm walking towards now what happened last week when it comes to what the regime was saying, the projection of the peace agreement, even without having to discuss about the suffering of civilians. That is like, forget it. We don't talk about that. If you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. There is that political atmosphere in that country where talking about civilian suffering means like you are sort of like creating it. Even if you are talking with evidence, with irrefutable evidence, you're immediately dismissed. And so there's that eagerness to move into, we are projecting peace. We are about to sign peace agreement. So while civilians are suffering, a new theater unfolded last week. And that is the peace agreement. Hona, I want you to briefly touch upon what was that peace agreement. It's now becoming clear that it was more of a political PR than actual peace. But from your experience, from your knowledge, who signed what? How is that peace agreement manufactured and brought into the public's attention? And which is the Fano organization that signed the peace agreement? If you can, I know this is a very broad question that I'm asking you, but I hope you will be helping me, frame it in a very simple way that many people who are confused can understand it. Hona, please.
Yeah, and I think this is an important question, and I think it's, as you rightly said, there's a lot of confusion. So this is a good opportunity to clarify that. But one thing I want to say before I go to that, I think you rightly pointed out the collapse on the protection mechanism against civilians. I would go beyond that, Tsedale, to say that the moral sanctuary, the idea that civilians need to be protected, has collapsed in Ethiopia. And this has led to, yes, it's a regime that is perpetuating, this atrocities. Yes, it's the military commanders that are sending the civilians or the drones that are dropping these devastating bombs across schools, across religious institutions, across markets in Amhara region, which hundreds of them my organization has documented. But you see many others outside the military cheering this. To me, that is very, very scary. So there is a moral collapse beyond the institution. And I think in a way, this is also related to the peace, so-called peace agreement that we have seen. Normally, if there was morality, if there was any dignity, even among the regime supporters, they would not portray what happened last week as any form of peace deal. But because there is just no more, moral standing, whatever is useful for PR is thrown at. anyone, including non-Ethiopian international organizations such as the African Union. But let me just take a step back and say what happened, because that is important. So what happened was this individual, Masresha Seti, who is a member of the Amhara Fano People's Organization, which is one of the two Fano, under Skender, which is one of the two Fano organizations at the moment, the other being the Amhara Fano National Front. And at the moment, we have heard the two are in discussion to merge. So this characterization might evolve depending on how the development unfolds. But Masresha was, one of the members of the AFPO under Skender. This individual essentially surrendered a few days before the announcement of this peace deal, and the regime itself, through the loudest social media activists, announced that Masresha has surrendered. So we knew, he has surrendered. We knew, he has been, hiding in somewhere between Gojam and Gondar for some time, and he has essentially isolated himself from the other focus, has stopped communicating to them, and that led into a campaign to locate him and kind of arrest him, essentially. But then I think he managed to escape and surrender to ANDF, and that news was announced. And then eventually, after 3 days, we all of a sudden see on news that this guy is signing peace deal. But the moment the news of his surrender came out, right before that, AFPO itself, the Amhara Fano People's Organization, has issued a public statement saying that him and somebody else, another one, two individuals, have been expelled from the organization and are no longer member of the organization. That came essentially 2 days before this news of peace deal came out. But after 2 days, we saw very shockingly a peace deal where the African Union representative and the IGAD representative were kind of attending, where this guy still claims to represent the organization, completely not addressing about that public statement whatsoever, but ignoring that and essentially saying, I represent the organization and we have signed a peace deal. And that is, in a way...
Let me interject here, Hone, because I can only say welcome on board, because, we have seen in the past the government repeatedly announcing peace agreement. It happened with the Oromo Liberation Army. We have seen that happening. It was also happening in the Benishangul Gumuz regional state. We've been reporting about that. So there's this unmistakable pattern whereby the regime, by the way, it's not only to the armed to armed actors in the country. It is also to non-armed political organizations, opposition political organizations. Whatever happened since 2018, whatever peace agreement happened, be that with the Oromo Liberation Army, be that with the OLF itself, Oromo Liberation Front, be that even with the Ogaden Liberation Front, who were formerly, armed. I think it deserves a revisit to see the pattern. You will see the pieces falling together here. So I'm saying, welcome. The Amhara Fanos are the latest addition to this very established pattern by the government of co-opting, first projecting a peace agreement, and then co-opting a few individuals that lack the real command authority, or either expelled or do not really represent, and then sign that one and then plaster that all over the state media, sell that as a peace agreement. And then we are back to the same thing. The war in Oromia did not end with that peace agreement with Jalsani. The war, the intermittent conflict in the Benishangul Gumuz region, we just saw a few weeks ago, I guess even 10 days ago, more than 40 civilians being slaughtered by armed actors in Benishangul Gumuz, in Metakkal zone, which is highly troubled area there. And so we saw that pattern. That's why I'm interjecting here. I'm just saying the Fanos are the latest addition to this well-established pattern. But what is also very different here, and I want you to reflect on that because I know you have the knowledge on what regional peace architecture looks like. So we have seen the representatives of the AU, the African Union, and the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development or something, if I'm not wrong, endorsed the agreement signed by someone who we are reporting was dismissed days earlier. Hone, tell us, what does that say about genuinity of verification, neutrality, due diligence? Peace is not something that you could just trade for political legitimacy. What does it say about the institutions themselves? Legitimizing political theater rather than peace itself, because we really don't have peace, right? But what makes this one very different is the involvement of these two continental organizations. So if you could really share your ideas with, especially what does it mean for verification? What does it mean even for going forward for, the issues of neutrality and due diligence of peace processes by this organization? That's what worries me, Hone.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think in outlining the broader pattern of this co-opting by throwing out large amount of money to lure some fighters and then project that as a justification for further violence. This has been going on in Ethiopia, and this is a bread and butter of the regime in Addis at the moment. This is. And it's not even a secret, it's if you read his book, the Prime Minister Abiy's book, this is what for him is politics is about, unfortunately. But you're right. I think had it not been for the involvement of IGAD and African Union, I don't think this so-called manufactured peace deal would have even warranted commentary, just because we know this is just common, and one individual, all these individuals will have motivations, and the individuals will change their mind. The question is the broader movement vis-a-vis fighting. So the only reason we're talking about this is actually precisely because the African Union and the IGAD involvement was truly unprecedented, even by the regional experience we know. These organizations are supposed to be mechanisms for the state to regain its lost way, for the state to reestablish a positive state-society relationship in Ethiopia. There's a whole
more importantly, even for durable peace, right?
Yes,
durable peace.
Yeah. And the whole motto of the African Union around silencing the guns is meant to play a role where the continental body will negotiate, will facilitate negotiations between the states and state actors to make sure conflicts do not happen or are negotiated and resolved peacefully if they do happen. But in this case, what we have witnessed is the African Union essentially willingly extending itself as a propaganda machine for Prosperity Party. This is a disservice to the organization. This is, in my knowledge, unheard of in even in African context. We are used to the African Union dragging its feet to play the role it's supposed to play when it comes to conflict resolution. We are used to failures of following through peace deals, through verification, monitoring, and ensuring that peace deals are hold. But we're not used to seeing African Union, legitimizing a peace deal between an individual and a government. This is a new law, even by African Union standard, and it comes at a time where, given the global, international order is retreating, and the West is turning away from focusing on human rights violation and conflict mediation to really, doing whatever works to extract resources from Africa.
Transactional politics, yeah.
Yeah, in the means of like extracting resource from Africa, regardless of who is in power, whether there is peace or not. And I think even recent news coming from the United States is also an indication of like this. So at this period, one would hope the African Union would step up its role and get its shit together, essentially, to try to play much more active role. Sorry for my language, but it comes at a moment where Africans are exploring the usual mechanisms of peace resolution are not going to be there. We need our own means of pursuing peace. And the African Union, by signing into this thing, essentially is telling us, no, that's not what their intention is. And why it happened, I don't want to speculate, but I think it speaks to the broader pattern of dissonance between those who are in charge of the African Union and the broader need of Africans for a truly pan-continental institution that can play a bigger role. I think the bureaucracy within the African Union has developed its own interest. And as long as the money flow, as long as these professionals kind of get their work, as long as trips are taken, whether real consequence, real impact happens on the ground or not, is not being seriously taken. To me, I can only see it that way, because no moral justification can be given. No justification. I mean, the African Union obviously have recognized the response from the Amharas. They have recognized there was issues in not directly but indirectly, but they couldn't come out and publicly defend it once they issue a statement. So if there was any justification, I would imagine they would come out and tell us. The fact that they didn't do that tells me this was a bureaucratic mission responding to its own needs and willing to sell the image of African Union, probably to appease some local powerful power holders in Addis Ababa. But this is not the first time the African Union misses a step when it comes to the peace deal, even in Ethiopian context. And I think it's shameful, but it's not surprising. When it comes to the IGAD, I think IGAD has to be seen differently. Historically, these countries in the region, whenever they are chairing IGAD, have used it as a means of pursuing their domestic agenda, which is why it's not as effective as comparative organizations such as ECOWAS in Western Africa or SADC in Southern Africa. IGAD itself, IGAD has historical failures in terms of retaining independence from whoever is chairing the organization. But in this particular case, we know, Working W was a close associate of Abiy Ahmed, and has even, I think, to the extent even his involvement in I don't know, you might know better, but in other conflict mediations within Ethiopia, it hasn't been successful. But I think it's by and large it's because they don't have capacity to push back against the Ethiopian government. And in this case, I don't think they see it as a mistake. I think it was intentional. They would have signed on even knowing this was just an individual. So for the IGAD, we see it as just a failure that is explained by, the chairperson's desire to appease the prime minister. But the African Union, although the African Union has historically been very ineffective in pushing against whoever is holding power in Addis Ababa, even within that historical reading, I think this is a new law, and it's shameful. And I think the right approach.
I tell you what worries me even the most, not just the opacity of what took place, and the inability of the African Union itself to provide more details about what exactly happened when they call it the peace agreement. What worries me more, Hone, maybe you can agree or disagree with me, is that the potential of this in eroding, in deepening mistrust, and in hardening the resistance for a possible future engagement by these very institutions to mediate Ethiopia's endless conflicts, right? What is, the impact it has on on trust, because peace can only be achieved if there is a degree of trust, right? We have seen whatever they call it in the Tigray region, the permanent peace agreement, cessation of hostilities, or sometimes alternatively they call it a peace agreement. We have seen the lack of trust in the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement has done. And that worries me that this precedent now, the African Union and the IGAD, are leaving behind in terms of mediating the second largest civil wars that are really tearing the country apart in the second largest regional state in the country has come down to this, and that should worry us all, I believe, Hone. But there is also another worry, because what does it mean, elevating a dismissed individual as representatives? Do you see it could also fuel internal divisions within the Fano? Because sometimes this retail peace, co-optation of peace agreements, what they do the exact intended purpose of their fragmenting organizations, in creating seeds of suspicion within organizations, in creating that sense of delegitimizing one another. Do you also see that as a challenge, Hone? Maybe you can tell me from the prism of the Fano collective or the two Fano organizations. Do you think it's going to play a negative role in terms of really fragmenting what the organizations that are now coming together, as you said earlier, Hone?
No, and I think you're right. That was the intention, at least particularly from the region side. These co-options are intended to further create rift within the insurgents, and therefore that weaken. That's the calculation within the regime, and obviously that's a tactic we know. But in this particular case, based on what we have seen, how this news was received from the ground, I don't think that will create further kind of rift. There are particular reasons. One is because of the insignificance of the individual himself. If you see where he was in terms of he's from Gojam, by and large segment of the fighters in Gojam are under the MENA classes. And this guy was essentially pushed out of Gojam and was operating in the border area between Gojam and Shoa with a few dozen fighters. Of them, only 3 who are his bodyguards are assumed to have gone with him to surrender. So we're talking about just an isolated individual who surrendered himself, but to begin with, he was not, military-wise, he was not significant. There are definitely criticisms against certain individuals within the Fano movement for elevating this individual, given that he was not militarily significant. And there are individuals that at the moment, if you read, Amharic conversations on Facebook about this event, there are certain criticisms directed against particular individuals. But I think by and large, the response has been, this guy was not significant to begin with. We knew he had this inclinations, which is why we have always sidelined him, and therefore we have only been proven right. And therefore, the way to come out of this is, to merge together and kind of establish a consolidated organizational structure that will kind of forecast or predict and neutralize this kind of individuals or this tendencies. So as far as that is concerned, it has actually maybe counterintuitively contributed to the possible merger between the two organizations. So it doesn't lead into rift. But as you pointed out, the impact on trust in international organizations, that I think is the biggest loss here. Skilder, who leads at IFPO, has come out and admitted that they were in conversation with this organization, that they had series of meetings. According to him, none of these conversations were about negotiation, but about humanitarian aid and human rights violations in the region and what role the African Union should play. But it does show that there was willingness among the Fano fighters to engage this African Union and their collectives. Now, that is unlikely. I think the African Union will not be believed. They will likely be seen as an extension to the region, and this will have consequences not only in foreclosing opportunities for peace deal, for negotiation, but also in terms of humanitarian aid. What does it create in terms of the perception of non-Ethiopians in Ethiopia? It can lead into broader mistrust among non-Ethiopians, and this includes to aid organizations, diplomats, and all that. So, as far as that is concerned, the repercussion, the damage is huge, and this is why I think the African Union should acknowledge this mistake and come out to tell the truth, to say what is true and what's not true, and to redeem itself. Not for the case of just, regaining trust among Amharas, but I think broadly as a continental body to protect its image and its mission that founders of the African Unity Organization have laid out. Not to do is to kind of really disservice to that history, to that hope, more than the track record of AU's history. I think the hope people are placing on AU that one day it might become an effective organization is at stake here. And I think this should not be allowed. And it's really appropriate for the African Union to come out and clarify how this happened, why they were played, how they found themselves in these circumstances, and what are they going to do to regain the trust among not just Amharas, but all other non-state actors that might be in talk with them, hoping that they will play a role in resolving conflicts through peace dialogue.
Yeah. Hone, thank you very much for outlining this. But I wanted to ask you one last question. I know we have run a little bit longer than we thought we would. You mentioned about Iskandar Nega mentioning his communication with representatives of the African Union, and him saying that it was not part of a negotiation. It was an engagement. It could be an engagement about access to humanitarian services. Anything can be an engagement, but it's also a prelude to something that could possibly be a positive, moving forward, a positive gesture to end the current war through a dialogue or a negotiated settlement. I am always for that. I believe that all wars come to an end through negotiation ultimately. But I want to ask you, and this would be my last question, Hone. Imagine if the possibility of a dialogue exists there, a scenario, right? We all want that to happen. And that dialogue fails because we are now looking at this repeated pattern from the ruling party to not A, engage first, and B, if it engages, to not uphold its commitment. This is now really a well-documented pattern. I don't think I should say if when I'm talking about that. So I want you to say in few words, what is the most realistic and dangerous trajectory when it comes to the war in the Amhara region if negotiations do not happen, do not pursue genuine dialogue to end it? Where do you see this? What is the most realistic and also dangerous? I think when you are doing that scenario, it would be, the most dangerous scenario building. But where do you see that trajectory, Hone, if this pattern continues, dialogue collapses or dialogue does not start? What are we looking at? This will be my last question, Hone. I know we can talk for hours like that, but I hope to get you back on a continued topic on this matter. But just reflect on my last question now, if you will. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is definitely a broad question, and I will try to be as brief as I can. But I do agree, negotiation, peaceful resolution should be pursued. And I think as a person whose family member is still living in the middle of the war and is experiencing one of the worst in my entire life, this is the worst that part of the region has been. And there is lots of hope, and there's confusion and desperation among the people, and the people cannot carry this war forever. There has to be an end. And I think there should be willingness to engage to pursue peace deal among all actors. But the likelihood of that, I think, will continue to be minimal if there is no appreciation of the extent of the war, the nature of the war, and the possible way out. One way to imagine this conflict is, as I said in the beginning, this is a war that has been building for decades. It is a conflict that's beyond Abiy regime. It's perpetrated by Abiy, definitely, particularly the crimes that are committed by Abiy regime. But I think people need to recognize that this conflict might not be resolved if Abiy regime collapses. There are structural issues that are long-standing and beyond the Abiy regime. So I see people calling for coalitions, for instance, coalition against Abiy regime to try to topple Abiy regime, and that would solve everything. It will definitely be one way to stop the atrocities against Amharas, but and others. But the fundamental question is that Amharas raised decades ago will not be resolved. So there is a need to engage broader actors in conversation about what is Amhara's desire, what are Amharas are asking for, why they are supporting this very heavy, devastating war for years. There has to be a reason people, even after suffering this long, are supporting the insurgents. This is because there is a sentiment that there's the only way others can listen to us now has come to a point where we have to stand up for ourselves and defend ourselves and even maybe pursue other political agendas. I think the way to tone down that is to engage in a discourse that recognizes the pain and suffering of Amharas. And this is beyond Ethiopians. I think the narrative about Amharas has been fundamentally wrong. The idea that Amharas are, this hegemonic group in benefiting out of Ethiopia's nation state is very prevalent in the international policy circle, but far from reality. I met this narrative in person when I went to Juma University first for my degree. What people thought of me from that narrative and the poverty and the economic injustice that I as a person grew up was very contradictory. That led me into commentary, writing about Ethiopian politics. It emanated from my own experience of me as Amhara depicted in a certain way that is devoid of reality has led to, a resistance that we culminated in a funnel. So I think it's prudent about everyone. It's important for everyone, not just Ethiopians, but non-Ethiopians, to pause and ask themselves what they're saying about Amharas is accurate, is a wish and desire of the people. Because there's narrative that exists independently of the realities on the ground that's being perpetuated in the journalists, in the media, and in Ethiopian political discourses. And that is the reason why there is frequent miscalculation about Amharas. So the first step, I think, to kind of project a sense of willingness to listen to Amharas is to reconsider these narratives and kind of engage in conversation about separating facts and realities from the narratives, because this has led to mistrust among Amharas, and you might see this on social media, about even among foreigners, that no, they don't understand that, they don't get us, because they know us from narratives, not from realities. So I think it has to begin with setting a ground where Amharas feel like they are being listened and being understood. Once that happens, Amharas are not the only ones, I think, having political questions in Ethiopia. There is a need to engage in a thorough debate and reflection about what kind of Ethiopia we want to build that among Ethiopians, and that involves not having the nation state. I think Amharas are ready for that at this point. This is one of the developments we have witnessed. Is like in the past, Amhara's identity was very much narrated close to Ethiopia. Now, the Amhara movement is going in two parallel senses, and this is reflected in some of the Fano divisions that we didn't touch upon. But Amharas have come to a stage where
I love to come back to that, Hone, because this is like something that fascinates me, something that I would really love to understand. Exploring and examining that. We discussed about the structural collapse of the political system under the Prosperity Party, and we touched upon the humanitarian catastrophe that this political crisis, the political collapse had brought, and we moved to the manufactured peace. What happened last week. You were talking about the uncertain future, and I think this is where we need to really more, engage in a more broader sense of it. Because we will be ending this podcast, Hone, by asking this question, and I think I want you to take this question with you as well. Is Ethiopia prepared to confront the real questions, not the symbolic ones, before the crisis become irreversible, or are we already there? Like, are we in the point of return? Or are we ready to, or prepared to confront that, the real question, genuine communication and conversation, rather than the symbolic ones. So I think this requires sustained communication. This requires sustained dialogue among, the different national groups. So Hone, I think you believe in this, in the necessity of these two to have that frank and honest conversation. So I think we will be leaving this podcast now with this challenge in mind. I will be leaving it with this challenge in mind, that are we ready to confront that question? And I think I would be happy to have you back to discuss more about what does it mean? What is the relationship of the Amhara, as you say it now, traditionally and commonly known as the anchor of the Ethiopian state, right? How did the relationship of the Amhara with the Ethiopian state define and redefine itself today? I think this requires a sustained conversation, and Hone, for which I hope to get you back. But we would like to end the podcast, today's podcast, with this message. Hone, thank you very much for coming and making the time to have, and it's lovely to see you as well after many, many years.
Yeah, thank you for having me.